Shalom, good afternoon. I take great pleasure in welcoming you all to this international conference titled People on the Move, Migration and Mobility, organized by the Daniel Abraham Center for International and Regional Studies. Migrations and migrants' experiences have been the main axis of our activities in the past 2 years for several reasons. Because these are among the key issues facing all societies nowadays. Many of the political upheavals in Europe in recent years have been tied to immigration, including the lamentable decision of Brexit. The rise of xenophobic populist movements in countries like Hungary, Italy, or Germany is also tied to the real or imagined threat posed by immigration. The Abraham Center was awarded a grant from the Fritz Thyssen Foundation for a research project on migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. And C, and more important, there are several students here who write their doctoral dissertations on patterns of immigration and strategies of social integration, on the multiple identities of immigrants, on ethnicity, on diaspora-homeland relations, or on return migration. All these topics will be discussed here today and tomorrow. Many of the papers focus on Jews of different countries relocating to Israel, or devoted to Israelis relocating to other countries. Still, the comparative perspective is very present in this conference. It will be even more pronounced in our June conference, also devoted to more or less the same topic. Jews, like any other ethnic group, tend to believe that we are unique and different. And this is obviously true. But at the same time, Arabs are also unique and different, and Chinese are also unique and different, and Japanese are also unique and different, and I could go on and on and on. Our challenge as historians, sociologists, or political scientists is to try and identify what is particular in the experience of each and every group and what is similar in their behavior. All too often, certain phenomena that we tend to see as particular to Jews or to Arabs or to Asians are in fact not that unique. And this brings us inevitably to the continued discussion as to Jewish experiences and the importance of comparative studies, both within nations across different ethnic groups and also across national borders, looking at Jews in different countries. It is never either or. It is important to conduct research in both directions. Before I move to introducing our keynote speaker, I would like to thank all the people who have worked on organizing this conference. The Daniel Abraham Center has an excellent team headed by Maayan Nahari. Where's Maayan? Okay, over there. And the team includes Chagai Rubinstein and Omri Elmalech. So thank you, Maayan, Chagai, and Omri. I was told by Maayan that I need to make sure that you all talk to the microphone and look at the camera over there, because the conference is broadcast live. So if you have friends or colleagues someplace who are interested in listening to your talk, you can, text them right now as I speak. At any rate, we have assembled here a fine group of scholars, senior and junior, from Tel Aviv University and from other institutions. But we are fortunate to have here a distinguished scholar who has inspired many of us working on immigration, ethnicity, and collective identities. Jeffrey Lesser, a colleague and a dear friend, is the Samuel Candler Dobbs Professor and former chair of history at Emory University in Atlanta. Jeff is the author of several important monographs, among them Welcoming the Undesirables, Brazil and the Jewish Question, which was published in Portuguese and Hebrew as well, negotiating national identity, immigrants, minorities, and the struggle for ethnicity in Brazil, and discontented diaspora, Japanese Brazilians, and the meanings of ethnic militancy. Some 5 years ago, he also published the book Immigration, Ethnicity, and National Identity in Brazil, 1808 to the present, which has been used in very many colleges and universities around the world. Currently, Professor Lesser is the director of the Halle Institute for Global Research and Learning, and his visit here has to do with this new position of his. In a few days, Emory University and Tel Aviv University are about to sign an agreement on research collaboration, and Jeff is accompanied by the Dean of Arts and Sciences of Emory University, Professor Michael Elliott, who's here with us. He will sign the agreement on behalf of Emory University. Jeff's talk will probably be provocative, as most talks of Jeff. And you can guess from the title that it's not going to be boring. The title of his talk is Bad Health in Good Retreat, Walking Among the Undead in São Paulo, 1880 to the present. Jeff, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Ranan, as always, for having me here. It's great to be back again, seeing so many friends. Mayan, as always, thanks for the help. Hagai and Omri, I really appreciate it. So for the last few months, I've been thinking about the title of this event. I found this website image that was being used to promote it, and the image made me think of theories of diaspora or transnationality. I looked at it and there were no people. It was very theoretical. There were no humans involved in the image. It's an image in which mobility is international. You see the phrase immigration, right? That's an international word. And point to point. There's a visible starting place. It's actually like a starting line for a running race. But the end is nowhere. It's far away. So today, I'd like to talk about migration exactly in the opposite way that this image does. I'd like to think about what happens when we look at how people move in restricted and repeated spaces that maybe don't have clear starts and ends, but for the real people, they're clearly starting and ending in those spaces. What does it mean to think about migration and mobility related to things like blocks or buildings? Now, if I was a sophisticated academic, and many of you know me here and you know I'm not, but if I were sophisticated, I would tell you my presentation today was about geospatial micromobilities. But since that's not a set of words I have ever used in my life, and since I love popular culture, I want to pay homage to the film Austin Powers and just use the term mini-mobilities. It's clear and it's easy. I want to ask if studying people moving around and within small spaces provides different or alternative outcomes from maxi-mobility studies of diasporas or transnational networks. In other words, what happens when we don't start with this approach, but we start with a different kind of approach? My current research explores the relationship between public health as defined by institutions like universities and ministries and health organizations, and the health of the public as defined by real people. To do this, I'm writing a history of one single city block in the São Paulo neighborhood of Bom Retiro, and I'll tell you more about this neighborhood in this block in a second. And I'm using archival, cartographic, and ethnographic methods to do this. While most of you in the room are probably familiar with hunting for documents in archives, the ethnography that I'm doing is not oral history. Rather, about 4 years ago, I became a member of a medical team that works on the research block that's part of Brazil's National Health Service. And, actually thanks to Dean Elias, who's here with me today, some of the research has been done by my own team of Emory students, who between them are all fluent in Portuguese and Spanish, and English obviously, but also have on the team Korean, Chinese, Russian, Italian, and Albanian. In other words, all the kinds of languages being spoken on this little block in Sao Paulo that's filled with immigrants. For the last 150 years, the little block has included Brazilians, obviously, immigrants, and refugees among its residents. It includes the building that served as Brazil's first immigrant hostel, then became what used to be called a disinfectory. This was in a time when people believed that, in this particular case, immigrants were bringing all sorts of diseases and needed to be disinfected. And today is a museum and archive of public health. Across the street from this building, it still looks just like this today, although there aren't obviously carriages like that, they're cars. Across from that is the clinic where I'm doing the ethnographic research. It's built on what had been a vaccination center in the 1930s and a leprosy clinic in the 1950s. And so this is what this particular health clinic of the Brazilian National Health Service looks like. The block is one of the very few in Sao Paulo whose coordinates are almost exactly the same as they were 150 years ago. So this is one of the really important parts of the research, because Sao Paulo is a city in which, on the surface, everything changes all the time. But this is a neighborhood where that's not precisely the case. And so the block that I'm looking at is right here. And so this central disinfectory is here. The health clinic is right there. And while obviously some of the buildings have changed, one of the arguments that I'm making, or I'm trying to make, is that moving through the block today, like in the past, mobility, if you will, is experience of continuity. In other words, that when we move through this block today, when people move through this block, something is happening that can have a relationship to what happened in the past. Just showing you even clearer what the block looks like. Now, one of the reasons that I'm making this argument about the problem, or that the block is like in the past, is because of issues of health. And I'll get back to this in a second, but this is just an example of a project we're working on now with the municipal government of Sao Paulo City that has to do with identifying risks. And so we're, as you can see, all the way down to the block level. If I did something similar from, let's say, 1920, it would look just like this. In other words, and many of the risks are exactly the same. Flooding, and all the diseases related to flooding, garbage, and all the diseases related to garbage. Located at the confluence of two rivers, 18th century Bom Retiro, this is the name of the neighborhood, which you see here. Whoa, cool, awesome. Was dominated by plantations that served as country houses for rich Sao Paulo residents. Wealth mobility to Bom Retiro in that time was for leisure, and slave and working class mobility to the neighborhood ensured the comfort of others. In 1825, Sao Paulo's first botanical garden was opened in the neighborhood. You can see it here. And in 1867, workers started constructing the Estação da Luz railroad station. This means light, like the lights, railroad station that helped fuel the population explosion. For the last 120 years, Bom Retiro has been a 2 square mile central urban district. So it went from being where the country houses of the rich were, today it's in the center of the city. Today, 35,000 residents are crammed into the 30 small streets. Within the neighborhood's rough borders are Sao Paulo's largest open-air crack den, upper middle class and medium high-rises, and 1 or 2 story buildings occupied by the working poor. Many 2-story residential buildings still house small textile factories staffed with immigrant labor, just as they did in the late 19th century. Tenements, called cortiços or pensões, with shared bathrooms and often semi-open sewers, are typical of the neighborhood. The skyline is of predominantly 2- and 3-story buildings, a shock to those used to the verticality of most of Sao Paulo City. And these buildings, I'll show you in a second. This is a kind of an example of the cartographic work we're doing. So what we did was we divided the neighborhood, or we looked at the neighborhood by class, and then measured the size of buildings. Size meaning tallness of buildings. And not surprisingly, on this street, which is a kind of upper middle class street, you have buildings that are 3 to 10 stories high. But on the research block I'm working on, there's nothing above 3 stories, really. There are 1 or 2, but mainly above 3 stories. And again, this is important, I mean, just methodologically, because it's easy when you're doing a micro study to get caught in the idea that it's so unique that it doesn't speak to anything else. And so what I want to try to do is think about how this one little block speaks to other kinds of urban blocks in other kinds of places anywhere in the world. That's kind of the theory of this. And one way is to think about the working class and buildings like that. In the neighborhood, uncollected garbage is often piled up on the streets, and mini mobilities are often conditioned by an ability to walk around stationary objects and over broken sidewalks. Bom Retiro, like working class neighborhoods around the globe, has long been associated with disease. While many researchers study either the living or the dead, I'd like to introduce the idea of undead geographies of health. Again, both as a popular culture homage to my favorite show, The Walking Dead, but also as a way of avoiding this kind of living-dead dichotomy in a more serious sense, right? That living and dead are so wildly different from each other when we think about issues like health in these kind of neighborhoods. This approach emerges out of the moral geography idea developed by cultural geographers that suggests that certain people, things, and practices belong in certain places, spaces, and landscapes, and not in others. And this gets back to trying to think about why do things happen there, and how might they happen in other places, but why don't things happen, for example, in a fancy neighborhood? Undead geographies uses movement, space, and place to analyze how residents of this neighborhood with multiple life cycle cultures experience and experienced health on a day-to-day basis. Varying types of mini mobilities, when combined with undead geographies, allow us to think, for example, about residents of a space not only as humans, but for example, as insects or as horses, right? Because they're all part of what's going on there. Dogs on the street. Municipal health inspectors in this neighborhood often found that the tension between what they did and the residents was so high that they needed armed escorts to do their work. In fact, as part of this project, before I started working at the health clinic, I spent 6 months with, I'm not sure quite how to translate it, what's called the Vigilancia Sanitaria. These are the teams in Sao Paulo that get called out to look for mosquito breeding grounds, right? And so it's on a denunciation basis. So I spent 6 months going around looking at mosquito breeding places. It was incredible, it was interesting. But one of the things that I saw was a replication of that terrible experience of public health with the health of the public. as we'd go to places where there'd be a denunciation, and the residents would not let the teams in to look, right? Because they were uniformed, they were unknown, et cetera. So this, again, gets back to the same kind of situation or the same argument as before, that there's some relationship between the past and the present. In fact, on one of these visits where we were prohibited from entering a building, one of the workers said, "This is the worst neighborhood," and to my not surprise, I found a letter written in 1892 by a health official that called the exact same Bom Retiro neighborhood, quote, "the worst neighborhood in São Paulo." Over the last 4 years, as I said, I spent much of my time as a member of a medical team. The way medical teams in the public health service in Brazil work is they're assigned streets, right? So I'm on the team that covers my block. The team focuses on basic health and includes physicians and nurses and community health workers who are assigned to a micro area, and that's actually the term that's used officially, is a micro area, a geographically delimited space in which approximately 100 families reside. Community health workers are required to conduct a minimum of 200 home visits per month, and such visits are unannounced. What that means is that as part of the ethnography, I can state with some confidence that I've been in virtually every residence, shop, factory, whether it is a registered or unfactory, on this little block many, many times, over and over again. Because unlike the story I told about the mosquito hunting, where people are barred, the health teams are welcomed in these kinds of areas. And here's a picture of what's called the green team. Doctor, nurses, community health workers, Team Lesser PhD student, the brilliant Emily, and some clown at the back. Working with archival and ethnographic data, working with archival and ethnographic data often brings continuities over time and space to the fore. As I said, the open-air crack den literally reminds me of a Walking Dead episode, or an episode, I was talking with Emory earlier, of The Wire, if you've ever seen that show with Amsterdam. This is like the real life version of that. This sense of how it looks going in with the team was reinforced to me by one of the patients on the neighborhood, Senora Madalena. She makes a living by sewing in her home while her basically undead son consumes the home via his crack addiction, right? So you see these things happening in a very, very kind of intense way. The archival documentation that I use also becomes contemporary by doing the ethnographies. Let's take, for example, the health clinic and its physical organization. Sitting there with patients in the health clinic, it seems like a kind of interesting multicultural space. You sit there and you hear Spanish and Portuguese and Guarani and Quechua and Korean, all happening there in front of you. You get called into relief. It's really, really unusual when all of a sudden you hear Greek or Chinese or Hindi, but those happen as well. Initially, this multiculturalism seemed really different than the historical documentation was portraying the neighborhood, since that documentation suggested segregation. The documentation always talked about the Jewish part of the neighborhood, right? The Italian part of the neighborhood, right? It was all done that way. So sitting in the health clinic kind of made me think, well, maybe that's no good. But then one day I got the floor plan of the health clinic, and I started thinking about what that meant. And we started placing dots on the floor plan about where different people sat, right? We started literally not thinking of it globally or orally AU, but like mini spatially. And we started to realize that inside there, it was also segregated. There were really clear places where Koreans sat. And there were really clear places where Bolivians sat who spoke Spanish. And that was different than where Bolivians sat who didn't speak Spanish. And that led me to then start thinking in other ways, and I started realizing that in some ways, this little health clinic was kind of like an international border. And that when you walk in, you come in, there's an armed guard, you present documents, right? So again, doing this other kind of trick, this other methodological trick, led me to think about mobility in a really different way. My own mobility between home and research site and around my research space has become critical to my understanding of the relationship between public health and the health of the public. My trip begins on a metro originally built to take foreign visitors to World Cup matches. Remarkably, it continues to have announcements in English. It's very impressive, probably the least spoken of the many languages used on the metro. My metro ride ends at this Victorian-era train station built by the British that's now the hub for bringing the working class from the suburban zones into the city center. This is the light station that I mentioned. The station itself is surrounded by a mix of heavily armed police, often on horses, and residents without homes, many struggling with drug addiction. From the station, I walk down a street where virtually every building has a low-cost retail clothing shop on the ground floor and a sweatshop, right, an informal garment factory on the upper floor. In spite of this being in the center of the city of São Paulo, the sound of sewing often seems louder than the sound of shopping. Many of the buildings today are owned by Korean immigrants, and the sweatshop workers usually come from countries in which the dominant language is Spanish, although that may not be actually the language being spoken inside the sweatshop. It might be Guarani, it might be Quechua, it might be something else. This isn't all that different than 100 years ago, when the shops were owned by Jews and the sweatshop workers might have been from some other country, right? There's all sorts of transformation going on. In fact, these transformations are so intense that as recently as 10 years ago, the neighborhood's Jewish day school's best Hebrew speaker was consistently somebody whose parents came from Korea. My daily journey ends at the neighborhood health clinic, which serves about 20,000 patients a day, 20,000 patients overall. Just across the street is the archive, the former immigrant hostel disinfectory. Residences on my research block are generally nestled right up against the sidewalk, concrete meeting concrete in kind of mini perpendicular fashion. Houses might contain a single dwelling or two, but more frequently, there are facades with tiny metal doors whose internal structure remains a mystery from the street. Entering into these metal doors, there are open-air corridors with multiple rooms separated by crumbling blocks, door frames, and windows with billowing bedsheets. It was in a structure like this that Amelia Marino shot herself through the heart in November of 1913. The apparent suicide took place in one of these little tenements on the Rua dos Italianos, Italian Street, which is where the central disinfectory is. Marino's death did not go unnoticed, that she was born outside of Brazil, in Italy, and had remigrated to Sao Paulo from Argentina after being abandoned by her husband, made her a kind of every woman. She was dead, but the story was a press sensation. That she had a 2-year-old child, was living in a matrimonial state, but without a wedding certificate. Some of you might know what that means. And that her partner was a dentist who had immigrated from Syria, led police to wonder whether Marino's suicide was in fact a murder. On this Italian street, we started looking into things like suicides, and it turns out that in the neighborhood of Bohachiro, suicide rates were higher than in many other parts of the city. Believe it or not, you can figure that out. And it continues to this day to be a site of suicides, murders, and illness. Today, nervous members of the elite classes show up once a month on Italian street, usually in bulletproofed cars, to get high-priced medicines for free from the guarded pharmacy that is part of the health clinic, right? So this is, again, this is something Israelis may be familiar with, where the elites hate with a passion the national health system, except when they need high-priced medicines for themselves or for their children, or need high-priced kinds of medical care like cancer treatment, and they're very pleased to have that at no cost whatsoever. And so this is demonstrated kind of incredibly with the lineup of the fancy cars as people come to get their medicines. This going there and engaging with health, again, isn't all that different as it was a century ago when children used to go to the neighborhood, here bringing rats to be analyzed, right? And this was a means of income for the children of the working classes who couldn't work in factories, so collecting rats and selling them was there. Whether by car or by foot, there's a relationship between human mobility and non-human geographical spaces. This is where the undead part is important. Critical to this understanding is the relationship between the neighborhood, the block where I work, and the train station, which I showed you a picture of. It's about 15 minutes away by foot, the train station. The station today houses both suburban trains, urban metros, and was named a historical monument in 1982. In fact, the Portuguese term for preserving a building formally, for naming it, is a historical monument, is tombar, is the word. A word that both registers it's important to the state and, interestingly enough, means to tear down a structure, right? It's very curious. When you tombar a structure, you can either be preserving it or destroying it, right? Again, very, very complex ideas. In other words, the tombamento of the light station, like the tombamento of the central disinfectory, suggests that buildings are kind of undead, that they exist in real time and that they exist only as a memory. Mobility between the train station and the two primary health buildings on my research block have, over the past century, included corpses, joggers, and even a zombie when a man awaiting burial returned to the living as it turned out that he was dead drunk, not really dead. The station has a symbiotic relationship with the health areas as well via a series of arteries, right? So one of the things I'm trying to do is think about this as kind of a body, a series of arteries that we can call streets today. In the early 19th and 20th century, these arteries were in fact plied by these mobile disinfection units, which were sent out to meet the trains, to disinfect, and then return, right? So again, using this kind of blood, veins, etc. metaphor, you can kind of imagine it happening. These same vehicles also went around the streets picking up dead people. That was another one of their function because, as I said, corpses were a regular part of life in the neighborhood and are a regular part of life in the neighborhood today, right? Again, a continuity, not a change. As I mentioned, my ethnographic research is conducted with a team of multilingual Emory students whose own ethnicities as immigrants from Albania, China, and Korea, or as the children of Cuban immigrants, gives them insights into the experience of many residents of Bom Retiro. It's been one of the very inspiring parts of this project is to see how different the data generation works when you send a group of brilliant 20-year-olds out to have these kind of experiences that they're often relating to in a very, very direct kind of way. Contemporary versions of Amelia Marino, right, the person who killed herself because of the unplanned pregnancy, are completely common today, as are abusive and non-abusive spouses, just like in the case of Amelia Marino. It's part of Team Lesser's regular experience. And mobility, for us on the research team, is as critical as it is for people in the neighborhood, because we spend the day walking around the park as members of the health team, just as real people do, who are going to the clinic, going to the store, doing whatever it is they have to do. Mini mobilities are particularly apparent in the pop-up health clinics for sweatshop workers. These clinics start when the green team moves as a group, as an entire team, from the health clinic to a building that has single or multiple sweatshops in it. So the idea here is that the sweatshop workers don't have time to come for their basic health, so the health clinic goes to them, right? That's the idea of it. The idea is to bring health to those who are working 8 to 10 hours a day and literally rolling out of bed and going to work. So here's one of the sweatshops where we work. Each of these doors contains a single room where an entire family lives. And when I say the adults roll out of bed, I mean, I literally mean they roll out of bed and get to work. In Montecito, the healthcare professionals in the clinic are generally monolingual in Portuguese. It's one of the interesting parts about this, and again, reminiscent, I think, of crossing a border, right? I think about this a lot when I come home to Atlanta, and I see people from all over the world waiting in line, and I realize that the agents, let's call them, the immigration agents, basically can't understand a word other than English, right? It's a really intense experience, and that's one of the issues at this health clinic. In the sweatshops, as I said, many of the workers speak some Spanish, but the languages you hear the most are Quechua or Guarani. The historical documentation shows linguistic issues in healthcare to be ever present, and we see this in our ethnographic work. One of the most common things that happens is when we're in one of these sweatshops, and the way it sets up is like a doctor sits here and people go individually and they go to stations, pop-up stations, is we observe the sweatshop workers nodding in the affirmative when asked certain questions and then going on. And when they realize that our team is there, they often, especially younger women, run over to the research team and start telling them in Spanish all of the things that they're sure that the health professionals haven't understood, right? So again, this is something that's precisely like what was happening 150 years ago. It's a continuity, not a change. Since we're trying to be useful on this project, not simply observational, we've created some multilingual initiatives. Some of them, this is us doing physical exercises for repetitive stress injury. But one of the things we've been doing is creating multilingual signs for patients when there are, for example, vaccination campaigns. So here we have Hebrew, Portuguese, Spanish, Chinese, Korean, whatever, right? This is something we can do that can't be done internally. And we even put together a series of guides that the teams now take with them. So now when the teams in the neighborhood go out, they take out guides, and we have them in Spanish, Spanish, Portuguese Chinese, Portuguese Korean, and Portuguese English that allow certain kinds of questions to be asked. For me, one of the most gratifying parts of this project is that this has now been picked up by the municipality, and they're thinking about how do they do this. They've done some versions of it already in order to bring better health care to the public. So, to conclude, I've argued today, I think, that we should expand our data sets about migration and mobility to include small geographies, not just huge ones. I'm proposing that if we do this, if we think about little tiny spaces like homes, blocks, a business, we may see more evidence of continuities over time than much of the scholarship on diaspora and transnationality suggests. Certainly if we think of Aiwaang, I mean, this is all about everything has changed, right? The airplane changed everything. The internet changed everything. I'm kind of arguing, in addition to that, maybe some stuff hasn't changed. Adding buildings and adding buildings and streets to our analysis of people may break down the sharp distinction between the living and the dead and the past and the present. Using this approach via the lens of health, but I'm sure via the lens of many other things, allows archival, ethnographic, and even epidemiological data to work together rather than in competition. This is one of the things that I've been quite shocked about when I go and give talks, for example, in public health schools, is there's almost like this gap in how people are talking to each other. And maybe there's a way that we can find something in common. We can all be friends. Undead geographies suggest that health, often presented as a social and cultural arena that is constantly modernizing, in fact, changes a lot less than we might think. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
Stay here.
Yeah. You delivered a provocative talk as expected. Thank you.
You're welcome. I promised.
We have time for questions and comments about the specific neighborhood, about the kind of sources that Jeff and the lesson has been using, how useful, if at all, in this.
Wow, thank you for that. Thank you for that positive reinforcement, Ranan.
I want to provoke it. On your own research. So who wants to start? Maybe each one could say something about himself, herself, in their own research.
James Green, I'm a professor of Latin American focus on the design industry at Brown University. Presenting tomorrow. Jeff, really wonderful, interesting presentation. I'm wondering if you're not making a structural argument about certain parts of the city or even parts of the neighborhoods maintain a specific purpose of being close to transportation or in an unproductive area of the city in terms of gentrification, and then just cycle different kinds of people through them. So there's continuity, but there's a lot of change. I'm thinking of all the people who lived in Montevideo and now live in Jardins. So it's a place of stability and the opposite of stability in that regard. So what? I can think of many cities and many places that have the same structural relationship to production over a long period of time because of the geography and other socioeconomic factors. We're making a very strong Marxist argument about the fact that the working class is being exploited and continues to be exploited over a long period of time.
It's a Groucho Marxist argument.
I would make a response to that. So, can you kind of think about how this, what does it tell us it's different?
Do you want me to collect questions?
Yeah, maybe whatever you.
You're the boss.
I'm the boss. So let's take two more questions and then have Jeff respond and have a second round. So, yeah, sir.
So I'm Sergio Della Pergola, the University of Jerusalem, and I will be also presenting tomorrow. And my question follows straight the JJ's question. You mentioned implicitly, partly explicitly, the kind of succession, social succession of the Koreans coming after the Jews. And this is an observation that we find also in other cities. For example, Los Angeles would be one example, and we can quote several other cases. Do you have an idea what might be the particular chemistry that leads a particular group to follow into the steps of the former one? This is my first question. The other question is whether you wish to add a comment on intermarriage, that is the next step when you have separate ingredients. Do they intermingle in a way that brings to particular models of proximity and family formation?
Hi, I'm Mirit Bak from Tel Aviv University, African Studies. And my question is there, do you refer to religious practice in your study? For example, because it's Brazil, maybe some kind of referring to the Afro-Brazilian religious or Muslim, Christian, and is a religious practice that related to health issue part of this study?
It's a great question. Okay, so first, yes, of course, there's always continuity and change. I mean, I'm not arguing there is no change. What I'm arguing is that studies of immigration or diaspora or transnationalism or mobility or things like that often heavily emphasize change. And so I'm interested in thinking about continuities. I'm not saying I'm only interested, it's just something else. And that looking at this particular slice of life, which is this health relationship of people, seems to bring that to the fore. You're absolutely correct that if we looked at, for example, generational mobility, I mean, you put it perfectly. There are lots of old people in Bom Retiro. It's one of the oldest neighborhoods in the city of São Paulo, whose children have made it and live in jardins, right? No doubt about that. And there's no doubt that that's happening in other parts of that neighborhood. But that's only in one part of the neighborhood. That's certainly not the block that I'm living in, the block that I'm working in. Nobody's moving to jardins. Right? This is a very poor part of the neighborhood. It's a part of the neighborhood that nobody thinks of when you think of Bom Retiro, right? And so one of the reasons I've chosen that part, obviously there's the buildings there that are interesting to me. It would look different if I chose, I'm trying to think. For example, in one of the wealthier parts of the neighborhood, there's a building that used to be a Yiddish theater and now is part of a hipster, multicultural NGO activist group. It would look completely different, right? So that's that part of it. I think I'm also not arguing, that it's only class that creates the continuities in the Marxist sense. I'm actually trying to argue a little bit that geographies create the continuities. For example, the fact that this neighborhood has a certain kind of set of buildings, and for whatever reasons, right, I can't tell you why all those buildings haven't been broken up and put with high rises, but they haven't. And that means that in the neighborhood, certain kinds of class activity is replicated. So for example, it's not a surprise to see that as people who own shops get wealthy, send their kids off to college, those kids live in fancy neighborhoods and then they pass away or whatever happens with them. Other people move in, buy those shops, the sweatshops are still on top, and that goes on, right? So I think what I'm trying to do is think about this not with class at the center. So I get, but maybe that's not true. I mean, maybe class is at the center of everything.
Marxism from the structural economy as opposed to class.
But I'm not even thinking about that way of thinking about it. I mean, I'm trying somehow still just to understand how the residents of this block think about it. I mean, this is a struggle we all have as scholars, right? What do we do when our partners in research, which in this case, I mean, the people who live on this block are my partners. If they don't open things up to me, I don't do anything, right? What happens when they're talking about their experiences in ways that are completely at odds with the way that we might as a scholar? I had a funny experience. I was forced against my will a few weeks ago by a senior administrator at Emory University, not Dean Elliott, a different senior administrator, to participate in a forum about something called the Global South. I don't know if you know this term. These are two words I've never used in my entire career. I did a word search of my computer to come up with Global South. I've never used them. And so one of the things I thought I would do is, because everybody on this block, including the people who work in sweatshops, are highly connected through social messaging and stuff, I started writing to everybody on the block and kind of saying, Global South, what does that mean to you? Nobody had heard of it. And I started thinking about, so what would it mean then for me to discuss this project as the Global South when they haven't heard of it? And I decided I wasn't comfortable with it. So I'm still trying to work up a language of expression, which obviously I'm not that good at, right? Because this was a very academic-y type talk, but that would somehow relate to the individuals who live in this block. Again, I know I'm going off a little bit, but this is very different than other projects I've done in which the people who are my subjects or my partners have all been the kind of peoples who have, if I gave a talk at a university, they would show up at the talk and listen to it. I mean, that's completely common. And this is a community that it doesn't work like that. And so I'm thinking a lot about, like, how do you have that relationship with the research partners? So we've done things like we have, inside the health clinic, we did a photo exhibit. Right? That was one of the things we did. I've, done a talk in the street in which the health clinic invites everybody in the neighborhood, in which my job was to explain, what does this project have to do for them? Why is this project good for those people? To the people, like to the lady I mentioned whose son is a crack addict, right? She was there, right? So, I don't know. I know I'm avoiding your question, but I'm trying to get out of structural, I forget what the other word you said was, structural something. Okay. Sergio, yes, so I think one of the reasons that this neighborhood has this constant transition, right? It has its Italian moment, its Greek moment, its Eastern European Jewish moment, its Korean moment, its Bolivian moment, I'm arguing has to do with the geography of it. That on the one hand, the geography is that it's in the center of São Paulo, which means that commercial business of certain kinds is relatively easy. Second, because those buildings are perfect buildings for new immigrants, right? In other words, they're perfect places for somebody who has a little money to own the shop and the factory, and somebody who has no money to work in the shop. And that's the replication over time. And that kind of explains why you have what would seem to be certain ethnic groups dominating at certain moments rather than others. As you say, that's not surprising. And that for me is important because, I mean, this returns to Ranan's opening comment. I was kind of snickering a little bit because he said, we know all groups are unique. And the reason I was snickering is because Ranan and I are constantly arguing together in joint articles how no groups are unique, how groups are all the same, right? And that this kind of obsession with difference is something that's part of being a member of a minority group or an ethnic group, but that as scholars, even the obsession is something that's very similar between the groups, right? So that's kind of how I'm thinking about it. Now, in terms of mingling, that's really interesting. I mean, that's why I showed that little picture of the floor plan where we started putting the dots there, because it could look like there's mingling, but I'm not sure there actually is. I'm not seeing it. You don't see a great deal either today or in the past of, for example, interethnic marriage in the neighborhood. However, exactly the people that Jim was talking about, in other words, the non-intermarried parents whose children go to college and move to the fancy neighborhood, they're definitely intermarried, right? So if we take Jews as an example, I mean, Jews have among the highest intermarriage rates in Brazil, right? My guess is 25 years from now, we'll see the same with Brazilians of Korean descent, right? As we currently see with Brazilians of Japanese descent. Religious practice, yeah, that's a really interesting and intense question. So in the neighborhood, there's definitely religious institutional domination, Jewish, Catholic, and non-Catholic Christian, sometimes divided by ethnicity. So, for example, Korean Christian operations are clearly different than Brazilian Christian operations. There's also a fair amount of syncretic practice, although generally not in this neighborhood syncretic practice with African religions. There's a lot of a religion called positivism, kind of a kind of spiritual intellectualism that's common among people in the neighborhood. There's also a certain amount of health organization by religion. So, for example, Korean immigrants in the neighborhood, if they make it, stop going to the health clinic and start participating in internalized Korean health networks, which are, I mean, the pattern is just as you would expect. The parents live in the neighborhood, the kids have gone off to college and become doctors and nurses and whatever. They live someplace else, and they come in on Sundays to the church and do an entire health operation in Korean only, right? And so that's like another thing that's going on there. I mean, it's been amazing with Team Lesser.
Let's try to have a second
Yeah, sorry.
round.
Okay.
Because of time.
Yes.
Any other comment or question?
Absolutely.
Jeffrey, thank you so much for your talk. Thank you. Jeffrey, thank you so much for your talk. Two kind of quick questions. So the first one, in your talk as a whole, and especially towards the end, you were engaged with the idea of continuity, and towards the end, I think you used the word repetition with regards to talking about like experience, mobility, and migration. So I wanted to ask you, first question, I wanted to ask you just from your project, what could you tell us, or what did that tell you about health and just the human experience as a whole? This idea of repetition is very viable to me, and yet haunting and tragic nonetheless. And also another kind of question, I was wondering, the space that you were talking about in your presentation reminded me a lot of the Central bus station here in...
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay,
Absolutely.
Well, so you had been there, and
Yeah,
you had thought about that. And so
I
it
have.
remind me of that.
Right.
So I just wanted to see if you had paid attention, get that there.
Yeah, great.
I'm curious to know more about Team Lesser.
Team Lesser, yeah, they're the
And
best.
How they, because obviously these kids come into contact with, thank you, come into contact with a reality that's very, very different. And they have to deal, I mean, they know the language, they may come from, belong to an ethnicity or country of origin that's represented there. They must be affected.
Yes.
And do they keep a journal, do they keep a diary, whether they record their impressions and so on to see what that could be used later on in the research, that kind of thing.
And I would add a question. You made a quick remark about the interactions between immigrants on the one hand and the non-human members of the community, animals, dogs, etc.
Yes.
I'm curious to,
Not just immigrants, all humans.
Okay.
All humans. All right. Dogs, mosquitoes. Yes, very good. Okay. So for me, it was something new to think about migration as repetition. I think I always thought about it as kind of a thing that has a start and then it ends, and then the end is this new start or something like that. And once I extracted immigration from mobility, and I kind of centered mobility rather than immigration, I started to realize that how much time we spend going to the same geographies over and over again. And so that's what I'm trying to think about. What does it mean to have mobility that's kind of never-ending or circular or something like that? And there are parts of it, you're right, that are haunting and tragic, like walking over piles of garbage all the time and getting really pissed off about it. Or having to walk past a giant crack den and all the emotions that go with that. But there are also parts of it that are very comforting. I mean, that's been one of the interesting parts of being in this part of the neighborhood where people don't go off to live in, the children don't go to college and do all this other stuff. And people talk about living in the same home where their parents and grandparents did, talk about a kind of a very small life that I don't think, it's certainly not the kind of life that the people who I've studied in the past in Brazil have lived, where I've studied more classic immigrants. It is perhaps somewhat more life in Israel, right, where kind of everybody knows everybody, within their class things. And yeah, I think the central bus station area, for example, would be another perfect place to do this. Ranan also took me to, what's that building in downtown Tel Aviv? It has 2 floors. Bet Romano, right. Oh, we went there, right, together. Yeah. This is another place. I mean, it's kind of hipster now, but it's also kind of got those old garment shops in there. And I kind of thought, wow, you could apply this to just that one building. And what I'm making a bet on, maybe I'm wrong, right? I mean, it's a great thing about tenure, right? You can make the bet and fail. But what I'm making a bet on is that my little project is going to speak to the central bus station and Bet Romano and some part of Los Angeles and some part of BA. That's where I'm going with this. Rosalie, Team Lesser. So, first of all, it turned out to be less shocking to them than I originally imagined. First, because in the team experience, I learned about the lives of these, they're all women, as it turns out. And that some of them went through experiences that were not unlike these experiences, right? So one woman, you know, she was born in China, became a refugee in Korea. She has a single parent home, and at some point, you know, showed up and she lives in some little tiny town in North Carolina, you know, where some nice teacher figured out she was a genius and got her going, right? So in that part, I don't think it has been so shocking to them. I think it turned out that unplanned pregnancies aren't as shocking to Team Lesser as little Jeffy thought they might be. And no, I'm being serious here. Like these are aspects of the research that are getting to your point. And so in that regard, the realities I don't think were so shocking. The one part of it I think that was most shocking for the reason you said is one of the women is focusing on leprosy. Leprosy is still an important disease in Brazil, and has been able to go to the former colonies where there are still people living there and engage in those kind of ways. And that's really been shocking, much more shocking than drug addiction, for example. Okay. Dogs and mosquitoes. Yeah, so one of the important parts of this for me is I've learned a little bit about epidemiology. The project started with one of our colleagues at Emory, who's an epidemiologist who works on mosquito-borne diseases. And it's kind of alerted me to thinking about the human experience in other kinds of ways. And also, it's alerted me to see how much people, at least on this block, both historically and contemporarily, know about non-human aspects of health. So just give one quick story. At one point, the Central Disinfectory wanted to build stables for horses in front of what is now the health clinic. And there was essentially an uprising in the neighborhood because all the people, this is like in 1913, let's say, all the people in the neighborhood understood perfectly well that horses and stables were mosquito breeding grounds and that mosquitoes brought disease. They might not have had an epidemiological way of talking about it, but they understood it and got it shut down because this is a neighborhood with tons and tons of issues. And we've had contemporary versions of this, for example, in movements in the neighborhood to get the owners of the sweatshops not to pile up their trash in certain ways. Because what happens is the trash is there, it's uncollected, it rains, and the water is in there. So like these are things I'd never thought about before, like how long does it take for mosquitoes to breed? And what does that mean in your little micromobility? Because that pile of garbage there that we might, or I might think of as ugly, right? It has an entirely different context when you think about it from the perspective of the mosquito.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.